March 1945. The war in Europe is almost over, but the final chapter has not yet been written. On paper, the Allies are united. In reality, the alliance is strained, competitive, and quietly fighting over who will shape the post-war world. On this morning, that tension will surface not through gunfire, but through a single radio message, a message so politically explosive that it will force one of the most powerful men alive to choose between national pride and ending the war faster. Winston Churchill is airborne, minutes from landing in Germany. Below him, British forces are preparing what is meant to be a moment of triumph. Operation Plunder, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's meticulously planned crossing of the Rhine, is designed not just as a military operation, but as a statement. This is supposed to be Britain's moment. Months of preparation, massive artillery barrages, airborne drops, carefully staged press coverage. Churchill has personally ensured that photographers and correspondents are ready. The message is clear. British professionalism, British discipline, British methodical warfare will be on full display. Then the radio crackles. For words, cut through the cabin and stop everything. Patton crossed last night. Not today. Not with Montgomery's grand operation. Last night. Quietly. Improvised. With assault boats and speed. In that instant, Churchill understands what has happened. George, Patton has crossed the Rhine ahead of schedule, ahead of plan and ahead of Britain. And in doing so, he has triggered one of the most uncomfortable crises of the entire war, not between allies and enemies, but between allies themselves. To understand why this moment is so explosive, you need to understand what Montgomery had been promised. Months earlier, Churchill had personally assured him that Operation Plunder would be the centerpiece of Allied victory in Western Europe. Not an American dash, not improvisation, but British professionalism. Montgomery had spent weeks assembling overwhelming force, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, artillery measured in the thousands of guns. It was the British way of war: prepare endlessly, strike decisively, minimize risk. Patton had never believed in that philosophy. On the night of March 22nd, Patton made a decision that ignored protocol, bypassed coordination, and shattered the planned narrative of the war. Without waiting for Montgomery, without asking permission, his Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim using assault boats and speed. Casualties were minimal. The bridgehead was secured before most Allied commanders even realized the operation had begun. When Eisenhower learned of it, he immediately grasped the political disaster Patton had created. Militarily, it was a success. Politically, it was a grenade. Because Patton had just done in hours what Montgomery needed months to prepare, and he had done it first. Montgomery's reaction was not loud, it was cold. To him, Patton's action was not brilliance. It was insubordination at the highest level. A violation of coalition command structure. A direct challenge to British authority. He demanded Patton be relieved of command immediately, not debated, not reviewed, removed. And that demand landed on Winston Churchill's desk as his plane touched down. Churchill now faced an impossible equation. Support Montgomery, and he would be demanding the firing of America's most aggressive general for succeeding too quickly. Support Patton, and he would be publicly undercutting British military prestige in front of the world, admitting that British methods were no longer setting the pace of modern war. As Churchill met Montgomery on the airfield, the tension was unmistakable. This was not just a dispute between generals. It was a collision between two military cultures and two national futures. Montgomery insisted discipline mattered more than success. That if Patton were allowed to ignore command authority, the coalition would descend into chaos. Churchill listened, then asked a single devastating question. If Patton had asked permission to cross the Rhine that night, would Montgomery have allowed it? Montgomery answered honestly, no, That answer changed everything. Because in that moment, Churchill saw the truth he had been avoiding for years. This was not about discipline alone. It was about pace. About who could move faster than the enemy and faster than their allies. Churchill had watched this pattern repeat itself throughout the war, Patton racing across France. American forces exploiting gaps before German defenses could reform. British units advancing carefully, professionally, and slowly. It had worked, but it was no longer decisive. The war was ending, and every day spent planning was a day the Soviets moved further west. Speed had become strategy. Standing on that German airfield, Churchill realized something deeply uncomfortable. British military doctrine, the doctrine he had defended for decades, had been surpassed. Not in courage, not in competence, but in tempo. When Montgomery demanded Patton's removal one final time, Churchill's response was brutally honest. Yes, Patton had violated protocol. Yes, he had ignored coordination. Yes, in any textbook military structure, he would face consequences. But firing him would force Churchill to explain to the Americans why their most effective general was being punished for winning too quickly, and Britain no longer had the leverage to make that demand. America was providing the majority of men, material, and momentum was now everything. Churchill declined Montgomery's request. Instead, he sent a quiet message to Eisenhower, recommending no action be taken, and added a handwritten note that revealed his true calculation. Keep Patton moving. We can't match his speed, but we can't afford to lose it. That night, away from cameras and commanders, Churchill admitted the truth to his physician. Britain was no longer the senior military partner in the alliance. It hadn't been for some time. The empire that once defined modern warfare was now trying to keep pace with a faster, more aggressive American doctrine. Montgomery never forgave him. British leadership was furious. Formal protests were filed. But Churchill understood something they did not. Authority without leverage is illusion. Demanding Patton's removal would not restore British prestige. It would expose its limits. The consequences rippled through Allied command. American generals understood the message immediately. Results mattered more than protocol. Speed mattered more than symmetry. And Patton, characteristically blunt, wrote that the British had finally realized this was no longer their war too direct. Years later, Churchill would acknowledge it openly. Patton's crossing had not just beaten Montgomery to the Rhine. It had exposed a shift in how wars were now fought and who would lead them. This was not a story about insubordination. It was a story about transition. About the moment one power realized it was no longer setting the standard. Montgomery represented professionalism, preparation, and tradition. Patton represented speed, risk, and a willingness to act before permission arrived. Churchill, forced to choose between pride and results, chose the general who could end the war faster. And in doing so, he acknowledged a reality Britain had been avoiding since 1942 in modern warfare: the side that moves fastest wins. And Britain could no longer move fast enough. This really happened.